Monsters are a huge part of the world of Dungeons & Dragons, both in the fiction of the fantastic dungeons and environments that our characters explore, and also the rules that we use in combat to battle them.
And today we're going to pull out a scalpel and dissect what's under the hood of a monster stat block.
Greetings, Dungeon Masters. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes.
And today we're taking a look at monster stat blocks in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
These things are all over our books, whether we're looking at a copy of Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes or the classic Monster Manual. But they're not the only thing that's in these books, and they're not the only thing you need to know to use and run monsters in your game.
There's lots of lore and other bits of information in here that can really bring your monsters to life. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, as well as look at the stat blocks and all the information that's packed into them.
Yeah, we really want to help you merge both the story and lore of a monster with the game rules that come with them. Every single entry in the monster manual, that monster stat block is usually only about a quarter to a half of the page itself. And so it's important to use both those elements together to really make your monsters into the fearsome, deadly, and memorable adversaries that they need to be in an awesome Dungeons & Dragons campaign.
So with that, let's get rolling. So beyond the stat blocks in the Monster Manual, Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes,
and Volo's Guide to Monsters.
There's a lot of lore. And as we were saying, sometimes the lore will take up way more space than just the stat block. And this lore can be used to really fill out role-playing ideas, inspiration for the way your monsters are going to be handled in combat. You can almost base entire campaigns on the lore that you read about these monsters.
It's so easy to ignore these sections in the Monster Manual and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, particularly as we're using digital tools like D&D Beyond, Kobold Fight Club, and other ways of accessing and organizing and sorting our monsters just by challenge ratings, just to build an interesting combat encounter, but forgetting that every monster needs to have a story and a purpose. What is it doing in your world? What is it doing in this dungeon? What is it doing in the city or in the wilderness where the players are going to encounter it? What is its day-to-day life like? What are its goals? What does it want and need? By thinking about these things and reading the Monster Manual, Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, and Volo's Guide to Monsters, you can get a lot of ideas and inspiration that, as Kelly said, can inform an encounter, an adventure, or even an entire campaign, just from a couple paragraphs in one of these books. I've noticed that over the years, many Dungeon Masters love using humanoid non-player characters as their adversaries, and really miss out on the opportunities that monsters present when they're integrated into other groups. Every evil cult needs to have a horrible monster backing it up, but they have so many more things that they can use. In our home campaign, I'm really careful to make sure that the Hobgoblin army has legions of ogres, ferocious, monstrous mounts, giants that they've press-ganged into service, and that all of these creatures have a purpose in the overall notion of the campaign that I'm trying to tell. The ogres aren't just bodyguards, they're brute labor, right? The chimeras and the wyverns and the manticores are mounts and reconnaissance. And keeping ideas of like how other creatures interact with each other really makes your world come alive and get your players' imagination thinking about how can we dismantle these encounters. When you're thinking about how your monster has a place in the story and presenting the monster in those ways, your players are going to very quickly pick up on those signs as you're describing them when they encounter them. And rather than going right to swords drawn, they're going to be thinking about these creative approaches instead.
Another thing that I like to look at is tying monsters to a location. So we just talked about like every great villain needs its hordes of monsters. It's like big monsters, things like that. But I'm going to, of course, use Lord of the Rings as an example. The Balrog was not of the Orc legions.
Yeah.
It was tied to a location. And that is one of the most memorable moments in the campaign that is Lord of the Rings. And it's because they went to a specific location, they were fighting goblins and trolls and that sort of thing, and then all of a sudden, something scarier happened, and it's a memorable monster. But because of the lore of that monster, it was tied to this particular location. It fit in there. It wasn't just a random happenstance. It belonged there.
And I love this idea of that's addressed in works like the Witcher series, where the people live in a world of monsters, and they need adventurers to get rid of the nest of hippogriffs that have taken roost. They need monster hunters just to protect their livestock, and that it's almost like this natural disaster that can occur. Even when we're figuring out how to use monsters in the context of our encounters and our worlds, the other thing that's important about understanding a monster's lore and paying close attention to its stat block is that the story doesn't stop just because swords have been drawn. There are so many ways to make the monster's motivations, its goals, come out in combat itself as you're role-playing that monster. So, let's crack open the monster manual and take a look at a monster stat block and break it down.
So we've opened up our book to the Pit Fiend. We're going to take a look at its stat block, all the different parts, and everything that it has in there.
Now, the Pit Fiend, of course, is a giant monster with a challenge rating of 20. Doesn't show up in a lot of campaigns. But the reason why we picked it as an example for this video is because the Pit Fiend basically has a little bit of everything you need to be worried about in a monster. And it's a great place to start to see all the different features of a monster stat block.
So first of all, you obviously have the name of the monster. For this example, it's going to be Pit Fiend. But then right under that is a little bit of important information. The first one being its size.
Yeah, and then you get the creature type, its subtype, if it applies, and the creature's alignment. And already we can get a lot of really important information about just this that matters for the game.
Yeah, so for example, the size of the monster can have an impact on the way that it interacts with certain spells and certain game mechanics.
Not the least of which is how much space it takes up in the game world or battle map. For those of you that like using miniatures, typically small and medium creatures take up only one space on a combat grid, but large creatures take up 4. Huge creatures take up 9, and gargantuan creatures take up 16. So the bases on those miniatures are usually pretty big.
It's a lot of space.
Yeah. And with the tiny creatures, usually having like tiny, cute little bases.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so a creature's size, interestingly enough, actually has some cool things in its game rules that can really be useful to know when you're homebrewing your own creatures. The first thing is that a creature's size is actually directly tied to the size of its hit die. A medium-sized creature always has a D8 hit die, whereas a huge creature always has a D12. Bigger creatures, more hit points.
It also applies directly to their damage.
As soon as creatures get over medium size, their weapon attacks usually have multiple dice, and it's usually for every size larger than medium, they get an extra die.
So if you're a medium creature and your damage is 1d6 plus whatever, as soon as you go up a level, it might become 2d6 plus whatever.
Whereas gargantuan creatures often have 4d6 or sometimes more, because that's multiplicative of the weapon that the creature is using. So a gargantuan creature wielding a greatsword would be doing 8d6 damage. Now, of course, that's assuming they're actually using a gargantuan-sized greatsword. But this is a really handy rule of thumb for when you're homebrewing your own creatures, is about how much damage they can deal. A bite attack is about the equivalent of like a two-handed piercing weapon, and claw attacks are like a one-handed slashing weapon.
I now can't get out of my head the gargantuan creature using a tiny greatsword.
Yeah, that would be like a toothpick.
Yeah.
That's like just its fingernail. So then we have the creature's creature type.
And this has to do with basically what category they fit into as a being. We have things like humanoid or fiend or celestial or
beast, monstrosity, aberration, ooze, plant, giant, construct. If I'm missing any of them, let me know in the comments. How could we forget undead?
How did we forget
How
undead?
did we forget that?
I'm upset.
Yeah, undead. Like one of the largest creature types in the game. And one of the ones where it matters.
Yeah.
Because a creature can be vulnerable or immune to effects based on its creature type. And this won't show up anywhere in its stat block, but it usually shows up in the specific abilities. So for instance, the spell Hold Person can only affect humanoid creatures. You can't use Hold Person on a giant or an ogre or a dragon.
But you can hold
monster.
Hold monster.
Yeah. The other interesting thing is there's a lot of spells that are of the mind control nature that don't affect undead and constructs.
Yeah, because they're not. They don't have functional brains.
Exactly. And of course, if you're a paladin or a ranger, it's super relevant for your primeval senses or divine sense.
Yeah.
Finally, a creature's alignment.
Which I don't really care about alignment. And I mean, for me, it gives me a bit of guidance in how to role play the monster. You know, as a DM, you kind of have the rights to throw that alignment out the window if you want and make a goblin who's actually nice.
As a player, if you encounter a red dragon, you can't assume that that dragon is necessarily going to be chaotic evil. Because a DM does have the ability to change a creature's alignment to anything they want it to be. Of course, alignment can be useful for determining what sorts of creatures might work well together in the narrative of your world. Lawful evil creatures generally will work very cooperatively with each other, whereas chaotic evil creatures have a hard time cooperating on anything, let alone agreeing without getting at each other's throats.
Yeah.
But it's there for you to use as a reference point and not as a pair of shackles.
Yeah, it's not really, I wouldn't say it's overly important to the game mechanics, but for story, lore, world building, and role playing, it's a little bit of information that can help guide you.
Our next section concerns the creature's armor class, hit points, and speed. The first thing that trips up many new dungeon masters is you see the creature's hit points, and then right beside it you see this number of dice. And we mentioned this earlier in the video that that's the creature's hit dice. Just like a player has hit dice, so does a monster. And in fact, monsters can take short rests and spend their hit dice to gain their hit points back. Those hit dice also reflect the range of possible hit points that monster can have. So just because your average pit fiend has 300 hit points doesn't necessarily mean that this pit fiend that the players are encountering needs to have that many. A pit fiend has 24 d10 plus 168 hit points, which means that you could max out a pit fiend with like over 400 hit points if you wanted to.
If even for a low-level party, if they're fighting goblins or something like that, just maxing out one of the goblin's hit points to whatever the maximum amount it could reach is on its hit dice, just makes that goblin kind of like the commander goblin or something like that for the party to face up against. That's a little bit more challenging than the rest of them.
This is a little bit of a DMing dirty little secret, but you are not committed to the monster's hit points. If you want to as a DM, if you're in the middle of a battle and a monster's going down way, way faster than you thought it would, it is totally okay to give it a few more hit points within its hit die range, just so that it can get one more turn and get out one more attack. Oftentimes, particularly if you have players that are really good at character optimization, you're probably going to need to max out most of your monster's hit points anyways. You might even need to increase their number of hit dice and give them more hit points straight up. Because player characters, when I'm making my encounters, I usually like to see if my monsters, particularly my bosses or my leaders, are under the one-shot threshold, which means that if every player in my party attacked that monster with their best attacks, would it survive a single round? And if the answer is no, I'm probably going to increase its hit points, because player characters, especially smart ones, will gang up on the most scary looking monster in the encounter, and if it doesn't have the hit points to survive an all-out barrage by your party, it's a good idea to increase it. If you think a combat is dragging out too long, you can just zero that monster's hit points out, and the next good attack to take them out that's narratively appropriate, that can do that.
What about our armor class?
So with a creature's armor class, usually listed beside it, it will tell you if that creature is wearing armor, or if it has natural armor. Because monsters use all the same rules for wearing armor that player characters do. And so this actually allows you that if you want to put your ogre in full plate, you just recalculate its AC to 18. If you want to put your pit fiend in full plate, you're crazy. That's really mean. Why are you doing that?
I approve. Unless I'm playing in your campaign, then I don't approve. By looking at their natural armor, you can actually find some good narrative keys here to describe the monster. If they have natural armor of 18, that's as good as plate. So you can say that their hide and flesh look stronger than plate mail. Mm-hmm. And that's a descriptive word that's going to make your party understand, like, this is going to be a tough battle.
Many monsters have multiple movement modes, and this is where it's really important to pay attention to this little section of the rules on page 190 of the player's handbook that reminds you that multiple movement modes don't stack together. If a creature can fly, burrow, and walk, when it moves, that movement is counted against all of its movement modes. So if our Pit Fiend walks 30 feet, they can now fly another 30 feet. They can't walk 30, then fly 60. And if the Pit Fiend has started its turn flying 15 feet, then it can now walk another 15 feet before it now has to fly a remaining 30.
So next up, underneath that little section, we have the monster's ability scores. And this is going to determine pretty much their saving throws and all of their abilities and skills.
Yeah, a monster stat block underneath their ability scores starts listing out their saving throw proficiencies and their skill proficiencies, if they have them. If they don't, you're just going to use the raw modifier of that monster.
When I see the skills, it kind of helps me highlight, what is this monster good at? What are they known to do? If a monster has a stealth proficiency that will be listed under skills, that means to me that, hey, this monster probably likes to sneak around and hide a lot. So I should probably play that into the way that they approach combat.
Pay attention for monsters with high charisma scores and proficiency in things like deception, persuasion, and intimidation. In general, monsters and NPCs don't make intimidation and persuasion checks against the player characters, but creatures with proficiencies in these skills will give you clues as to whether or not that creature is actually interested in social interactions. I find for what it's worth to me, a creature that's proficient in persuasion is probably more interested in talking out a situation than necessarily fighting, and will parlay, even entertain the notions of a surrender if possible. And even a creature that's intimidating might be lazy and might want to try to talk and threaten other creatures out of a fight rather than actually making things come to blows right away.
So right below skills in the monster stat block, you're going to find the monster's immunities, resistances, vulnerabilities, and other such stats.
Yeah, not every creature has resistances or immunities, and they might have resistances to damage types, and they can have immunities to both damage types and certain conditions as well. A creature with immunity just can't be affected by abilities that inflict that condition or cause that damage type. Although in some cases it's possible for a creature to be immune to a damage type, but still be affected by the other elements of a spell. Some creatures, for example, might be immune to psychic damage, but they might take the other effects of a spell that causes psychic damage. Creatures that are resistant to damage take half damage from those damage types. And the most important one to note in this case is that many creatures have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical weapon attacks, or weapons that aren't made of a certain material.
Let's say, for example, with iron golems, if they fall down a cliff, they're still going to take bludgeoning damage because it's not from a weapon attack, it's from fall damage. And they are only immune to bludgeoning damage from a weapon attack.
Incidentally, there actually are some really rare creatures that are immune or resistant to damage types like that flat out, but they're very, very rare.
One of the struggles that I had is I would do an entire combat, and then I would look down and say, oh, I missed those immunities. So read this section and memorize it before you run that combat.
Gauge really carefully when you're selecting enemies with resistances or immunities to your party's favorite tactics. It's definitely a curveball that you want to throw in front of them once in a while, but if it's happening all the time, they're going to be really disappointed. After the creatures emit resistances and immunities, every creature has several different types of senses. These will include if they have dark vision or tremor sense or true sight. And creatures that have these special senses are extra perceptive. But the thing that I will point out is that just because a creature has something like blind sight or tremor sense doesn't necessarily mean that they have an unbeatable perception score. I could totally see, a earthbound creature with tremor sense can't detect creatures that are flying. Finally, we come to the monster's challenge rating.
The challenge rating pertains to a group of 4 players versus that monster. At that level, it will be an even battle.
Yeah, so if you have a group of 4 7th level players up against 1 CR7 creature, it will be a medium difficulty combat encounter. In general, in our experience, when you match an even CR monster up against a party evenly matched to that, they're going to blow through it because a medium difficulty encounter is generally only designed to tax about 15 to 20% of the party's total resources, because it's meant that the party goes through 6 to 8 combat encounters like this every adventuring day, which rarely happens in our experience. Some campaigns do have multiple combat encounters happen in an adventuring day, in which case the challenge rating system probably works really well for you. But if you are not taxing your players with multiple encounters, you're going to find that player characters that pull out all the stops can defeat monsters with much higher challenge ratings than themselves, especially as player characters get to higher levels.
Yeah, when you start throwing in magic items, if you have more than 4 players at your table, if they're only doing 2 to 3 combats a game, these are clues that you need to use as a DM to say, I need to throw in some CR rating monsters that are relatively above where the party is. I have a group of level 12 players that are battling usually CR 16 to 18 creatures at this point. And even then, if they're only doing 1 or 2 combats in a game, they usually can handle themselves pretty easily in those combats.
Xenothar's Guide to Everything has really great and well broken down rules for encounter building that I recommend you check out. But as a rule of thumb, I like to say that DMs, you can expect that if your players are smart, savvy, and pull out all the stops, they can annihilate a monster with up to double their level in challenge rating.
So after that, we have a really cool section on the monster's traits. This is more or less the special abilities that really make this monster kind of stand out from other monsters.
Yeah. Oftentimes, these are passive abilities. These are things that are always on, but they might also include if the monster is capable of casting spells, whether because they have effectively class levels in a spellcasting class, or if they have the ability to cast spells innately due to their magical nature.
You might also see in this section there are some special abilities or traits that are repeated amongst various types of monsters. For example, things like pack tactics or
magic resistance is really common.
Yeah,
the Dungeon Master's Guide actually has a giant list of all of these common traits which are shared between monsters. And interestingly enough, it also tells you how these traits affect the monster's challenge rating.
One thing that I task myself with is reading the entire monster stat block right before the game session is the last thing I put into my head before I jump into the game session of that night. But this section is the one that's going to stand out and make you kind of realize the really cool things that you can pull out in that combat encounter that will make it unique and interesting.
The one big pitfall here, though, is the monsters with innate spellcasting or spellcasting traits, because the details of all those spells are not going to be included in the stat block, and spells are the one thing in a monster stat block that aren't really spelled out for you before the game session. So if you're using a monster that has the ability to innately cast a spell, you do need to do some extra preparation here. And if you're not grabbing those spells and figuring out what they do and using them well, the monster is going to be a real cakewalk.
Yeah. So there's been a little bit of a difference in the rules between, is it the Monster Manual and the Dungeon Master's Guide?
Yeah, they have contradictory advice about swapping spells.
Yeah, swapping spells. Can you do it? Can't you do it? What's your take on that?
Be careful. Both the books talk about what happens if you have a spellcasting monster and you say, decide to switch its Cone of Cold spell for telekinesis. And in some cases, that actually has no impact on the monster's challenge rating. But in some cases, it is wildly different, like the CR12 Archmage, who is capable of casting 9th level spells. But in the monster manual, the Archmage has time stop prepared.
But if you give them a Meteor Swarm instead...
They are not a CR12 monster anymore.
No, that's
not by a long shot.
That's going to wipe a party.
Yeah, that will wipe a 12th level party out completely.
Lastly, we have a monster's actions. These are basically their attacks and maneuvers that they can do in combat.
Now, many monsters might be using manufactured weapons, which means you can go ahead and swap in manufactured weapons and have them use different weapons. And by and large, I don't think changing a monster's weaponry out is going to impact its challenge rating all that much. It's usually only 1 or 2 points of difference for weapons, unless maybe you're switching out a dagger for a greatsword.
What's really cool here is you can look down the list. A lot of monsters are going to have multi-attack, and also a lot of monsters will have things like claws and bites and tail attacks. A bite attack or a tail attack being the equivalent of a two-handed weapon, whereas a claw attack is usually the equivalent of a one-handed weapon.
The thing to bear in mind here is that monsters have the same action economy that player characters do. They have an action, a bonus action, and a reaction. And some monster stat blocks will actually list out extra abilities that they can use with their bonus actions and reactions. So you do want to prepare for these things. Another very common trait that most monsters have is the multi-attack feature, which allows them to use many of their attacks all together at the same time. Often, like as a dragon, you can claw, and bite, which is kind of a standard trope. Most monsters get that.
Yeah, what's important here, as with all the sections in here, read carefully, because sometimes you'll see little hints in there of the way that these might work differently. For example, the T-Rex, who can make a multi-attack of a bite attack and a tail attack, but they have to be on different targets.
Yeah, so watch out for those kind of small pitfalls with a monster's actions, and never forget, just like players, your monsters can improvise too. And they can do all sorts of other things beyond the things listed in their stat block. How might they use their environment? Players are really thrown for a loop when all of a sudden the monster decides to kick over the brazier of coals or push them off the cliff. If you have a flying monster, pick a player up and drop them.
My character's been carried off by spiders. It's now an inside joke, I think, for us, that my character just keeps getting picked up by giant spiders and carried away. Read the monster stat block. Read it start to finish. Look for key words and phrases that are really going to highlight how you want to play this monster, how you want to portray it in combat, and also read the lore sections. That's really going to highlight why is the monster here, what is it that they're doing, and really just how are you going to roleplay it and really bring it to life.
Not every monster needs to fight to the death, and in fact, very few should. And you can have fantastic opportunities for recurring villains when your monsters make the decisions to surrender or try to escape. And that instantly makes a combat encounter way more engaging when the monsters decide it's time to turn tail and run.
So this has been our guide to the monster stat block in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We hope that you feel inspired to bring some vicious monsters to the battlefield.
And we would love to hear in the comments below your tales of how you wove story and strategy to make a truly memorable combat encounter for your players.
Of course, with all monsters, they're going to have several actions in combat, and you can check out our video on that right up over here.
And we've got more tips for running combat for Dungeon Masters right over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.